I sell a lot of things on Facebook Marketplace, and I also buy. Very few things have gone wrong for me, but I do have one terrible experience to share. This happened about 5 years ago, when I first moved into my apartment. I was sleeping on the floor for the first few weeks at this point. I had one of those foam camping pads that was actually pretty comfortable. I was ready for a real bed though, and I can never resist looking for a deal. I found an ad for a brand new mattress on Facebook. It was one of those compressed foam ones that expands when you take it out of the box, so I knew it was really new. I don't remember the actual price, but it was about a 20% discount from a new one. Not a bad deal. I sent him a message and didn't bother trying to bargain. We went back and forth a few times discussing the details of the mattress and setting up a time to meet. I agreed to pick it up the next day. It was small enough to fit into the back of my tiny car. When the day came, I found myself driving to a part of town that I'd never been to before. I was fairly new to the city still, so that was true for most places. When I arrived at the apartment complex, I parked my car on the street and got out. I walked up to the front door and checked my phone to see if the seller had sent me a message. He had given me the apartment number, so I headed up the stairs. The apartment was on the second floor, at the end of the hallway. As I walked down the corridor, I could hear the sound of music blaring from behind the door. I knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened. The seller was a young man in his early 20s, with bloodshot red eyes and a twitchy demeanor. He looked like he had been up for days, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was on drugs.
"Hey man,"
he said, greeting me with a crooked smile.
"Come on in."
I followed him into the apartment. The place was a mess, with dirty clothes and empty bottles strewn about. The music was coming from a stereo in the corner, and it was so loud that I had to shout to be heard. The seller led me to a corner of the living room where the mattress was. I was surprised to see that there were 3 of them. That was a bit of a red flag, and I wondered why the guy had 3 brand new mattresses in his apartment. I could understand if he bought 1, then changed his mind, but 3? I was suspicious, and didn't want to buy something that was stolen. I asked the guy why he was selling, but he gave me some answer that made absolutely no sense. I can't even remember it. It was total nonsense. After that, I was pretty sure they were stolen somehow. You don't make money by buying brand new mattresses and selling them at a discount. I told him I would pass on the deal, and I headed for the door, but he stopped me. He started shouting and getting in my face. I was sure at this point that he was on drugs. I knew I had to get out of there, so I pushed past him and ran for the door. As I fumbled with the lock, I could hear the seller screaming at me, telling me that I was wasting his time and that he was going to call the cops on me. I actually chuckled under my breath when he said that. Call the cops for what? Not buying a stolen mattress? I finally managed to get the door open and ran down the hallway as fast as I could. I could hear the seller shouting and cursing behind me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running until I was out of that building and back in the fresh air. I got into my car and drove back home. I was glad I never gave that guy my address. I never called the cops because I didn't have any proof of anything, and what happened in that place would just be my word against his. Not surprisingly, he never called the cops on me either, but to be honest, I was kind of hoping he would, just for the laughs. I had a bad experience on Facebook Marketplace last year. After much deliberation, I had finally decided to sell my car. It was a tough decision to make, but I was moving to another state, and it just didn't make sense to bring it with me. I had posted the ad on Facebook with multiple pictures of the car, and within a few hours, I received an overwhelming number of offers. Most of them were ridiculously low, so I just ignored those ones. One of the offers caught my attention, and it was from a man named Stan. He had offered the full amount that I was asking for the car, which was quite surprising, considering that most of the other offers were far below what I was asking. We exchanged a few messages and agreed to meet for a test drive. We decided to meet at a parking lot that Stan had suggested. It was a bit out of the way for me, but I knew the area pretty well because it was close to my friend's place. The day of the test drive arrived. I was a little worried about meeting a stranger online, but I did it anyway. When I got to the parking lot, it was almost dark. I looked around nervously, waiting for Stan to arrive. After a few minutes, a pickup truck pulled up. Two men got out of the truck and walked up to my car. They were both around average height, and they both wore blue jeans. One of them had a black jacket, and the other one was wearing a white t-shirt, even though it was pretty cold out. It was dark, but the parking lot was well lit, even though we were the only ones there. I rolled down the window and started talking to them. "Hi, are you Stan?" I asked. The man with the black jacket nodded and said,
Yeah, that's me. You must be Ben. Nice to meet you.
I smiled weakly and got out of the car. I couldn't help but notice that the other man was just standing there, looking at me with a blank expression. I started to feel weird, but I tried to shake it off and stop worrying. We walked around the car, and Stan started asking me questions about it. He seemed genuinely interested, and I started to relax a bit. We got into the car, and he started the engine. As we drove around the parking lot, I noticed that Stan was driving quite aggressively. He was taking sharp turns and driving at a high speed. I didn't actually mind though. Maybe if we were on the road, then I would have been kinda scared. After a few minutes, Stan suddenly stopped the car and turned off the engine. He turned to me and said,
You know, I'm not sure if I want to buy this car after all. It's not really what I'm looking for.
I was a little disappointed, but no big deal. I was hoping that this would be the sale I needed to get rid of the car before I moved. But then it seemed like a waste of time. I got out of the car and headed back over to the driver's seat. When I approached the door, both men were standing there blocking it. I stood in front of them awkwardly for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. That was when the other man pulled something out of his pocket. I thought it was a knife at first, but I think it was some kind of an ice pick. It was a long, sharp metal thing anyway. I don't know what it was, but he pointed it at me and told me to get away from the car. Then he demanded my phone. I fumbled in my pockets and managed to pull out my phone. I handed it over to one of them. I don't remember which one. One of them got into my car, and the other got into the truck. They both drove away together. As they were leaving, I tried to check the license plate of the truck, but it was covered. I knew I fell for one of the oldest tricks in the book, and I felt really stupid. Luckily, I still have my wallet. I don't know why they didn't take that too, but I'm not complaining. I walked to the nearest bus stop and managed to get home within an hour. I called the police from my laptop when I got home. Not surprisingly, Stan's Facebook profile was gone already, and I didn't get the truck's license plate. The police tried to help, but there was not much they could do. As the days went by, I started to feel angry. Angry at the men who had stolen my car, and angry at myself for being so naive. I couldn't believe that something like this could happen to me. I bought my first rental property a few years ago. I was planning to turn it into an Airbnb, and I was constantly looking for cheap ways to furnish the place. I still needed a bunch of stuff, including a refrigerator and some other appliances. One day, I came across a promising listing on Facebook Marketplace. It was a sleek and modern fridge, and it looked like it would fit perfectly into the kitchen. I sent a message to the seller, hoping to secure the deal before anyone else could take it. Then I put my computer away for a few hours. When I opened it again, the seller had responded with an address and a time to meet. They seemed eager to get rid of the fridge, and I was equally eager to make the purchase. The price was fair, so I didn't waste any time trying to bargain for a few bucks. I loaded up my truck and headed out. While I was still in my driveway, I put the location into my GPS. It was a spot that was out of the city, in a mostly forested part. I sort of knew the area, because I had gone out there a few times to do some hiking. As I drove down the winding country road, a worry didn't cross my mind. I had made many deals on Facebook and Craigslist before, and never had a problem. There were trees on both sides of the road, and the occasional house. The further I went, the more remote the area became. Eventually, I got there, and I pulled up in front of the address that the seller had given me. At first glance, the house looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and there was no sign of life inside. I almost turned around right there, but I decided to check it out anyway. I knocked on the door, but not surprisingly, there was no answer. I checked my phone to see if I could message the seller, but when I pulled up the conversation, I saw that the profile was gone. That's when I realized that something was up. I scanned the area, trying to spot any signs of life. I turned around and saw 3 large men standing in front of my truck. They looked intimidating, with their arms crossed and scowls on their faces. I tried to make my way back to the truck, but they stepped forward, blocking my path. Their faces were blank, as though they were trying to intimidate me. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal. The men continued to stare at me, not saying a word. No words needed to be said. I knew what this was, and I knew why they were here. They never pulled a weapon on me, but I'm pretty sure they would have if it came to that. I turned and ran past the house and into the woods. I didn't stop until I reached a main road, where I flagged down a passing car. I was already on the phone with the police at that point. The driver took one look at me and could tell something was wrong. I explained what happened, and he agreed to drop me off at a gas station, where I could wait for the police. I was waiting in front of the gas station for 10 minutes or so when the police arrived. They already knew what happened mostly. I told my story to the operator over the phone. We went to the spot where the house was. When we arrived, my truck was gone. I had obviously fallen into a trap. There was no refrigerator, and the men probably didn't even own that house. On closer inspection, it was definitely abandoned. The officers told me that they would continue to investigate, but there was a good chance that my truck was already being stripped for parts. They also told me that this scam is more common than most people think, and there was little hope that the guys would be caught. I used to use Facebook Marketplace all the time, mostly for buying, but occasionally selling. This story is about a really scary guy who I met on there. I had just purchased a brand new 4K TV, and I wanted to sell my old one to cover some of the cost. After posting a few photos and a description of the TV, I received a message from a potential buyer named Perry. It was only up there for an hour or two before he messaged me. He was interested in buying the TV, and asked me a few questions about its condition and functionality. It was in perfect condition, and 2 or 3 years old. I was asking around half the price of a new one, and they were still selling a really similar model, so I thought that was a fair deal. He tried to negotiate a bit, but I was firm. I didn't blame him for trying, and I came down a few bucks just so he could feel like he won. I gave him my address, and we agreed that he would come and pick it up the following evening. The evening came and went, but Perry never showed up. He never sent me a message or anything. He just didn't show. Before bed that night, I opened my messages and found another offer for the TV. I thought it was fair to give somebody else a chance. I made a deal with someone else, and he came to pick up the TV the next morning. I had all but forgotten about Perry at this point. Later that day, I got a new message from Perry. He wanted to reschedule and pick up the TV another time. I told him it was already sold. He then sent me a series of angry messages. He accused me of lying to him and claimed that I sold it to someone else while stringing him along. That was really crazy. I explained to him that I waited for him to show up, but he didn't, so I sold it to someone else. But Perry wasn't having any of it. He continued to send me angry messages and accused me of being dishonest and scamming him. I don't really think he knew what a scam was. I decided to ignore Perry's messages and hoped he would calm down and move on, but that's not what happened. The only thing that worried me was that I gave him my address. I was worried that he would show up, and that's exactly what happened. Later that night, I heard a loud banging at my front door. I tiptoed over to it and peeked through the peephole. To my horror, I saw a man standing outside. It was hard to tell from his Facebook picture, but I'm pretty sure it was Perry. I stood there behind the door, not knowing what to do. He continued to bang on the door and shout obscenities. I could hear the anger in his voice, and I feared for my life. It was really uncomfortable, but after 20 or 30 minutes, Perry took off. I couldn't believe he stood on my porch for that long. I considered calling the cops, but I didn't think it was that serious at the time. He was an older guy, and I knew I could handle him if it came to that. I didn't think it would, but I wasn't worried just in case. Nothing happened for a while, and I thought it was all over, but it wasn't. The next week, I noticed a black sedan parked outside my house, and there was a man sitting in the front seat. I noticed it when I got home from work at around 6 p.m., and it was still there at 8. Then I looked closer. I recognized him. It was Perry. He was sitting in the car, watching my house. I decided to call the police, just to be safe. Like I said, I thought I could defend myself, but there's no telling what kind of weapons he could have, and if he broke into my house in the middle of the night, he could catch me off guard. The police arrived quickly and approached Perry's car. They spoke to him for a few minutes before letting him go with a warning. They told him not to come back to my house and to leave me alone. I never saw Perry again after that night. I still don't know what he was planning, if anything. Who has the time to stake out a stranger's house all night over a used TV? I guess he didn't have anything else to do. He didn't have a TV after all.